I was driving here tonight I'm not telling the story, I'm just trying to get in the mood of the place I'm in. So I was driving here tonight from Canton, from the station, coming down the usual way on 56, and you pass that spot where Ham's Inn used to be, right? There's some other building there now, but to me it's still always the place where, so that must mean I'm an old timer, because people still call my place the Bowman place, right? I guess I've gotten into that, local groove of remembering anyway, and it made me think of Ham Ferry, who, we're at a storytelling event here tonight, and if you grew up or spend time here, I'm not saying a name you're not unfamiliar, right? Everybody knows Ham Ferry, or most of you do, I suspect. Many years ago, in the 80s, when I was first at the station, we recorded Ham, and we still have archival tape of Ham Ferry telling stories. I mean, he held court at the inn, and you didn't go there for the food, really. You went there for Ham, right? I mean, you went in, you drank a beer, and you listened to Ham spin a yarn. So that seemed like the perfect gateway to tonight's storytelling here in Cranberry Lake. I'm delighted to bring up Mark Friden. How do you say it? Friden. That. Okay. Mark F., the town historian. We really like to begin these events with the person who's kind of hosted us through the exploratory process in each community. And Mark has been our guide and friend and opened his files, his collections, and this space to us, and we're really grateful to him. So Mark, you're up.
Thank you very much, Ellen. I appreciate the warm introduction. I see a lot of familiar faces in this room, and I'm glad of that. It means that people that I know in this area who love this area and think about the history of this area a lot care enough to come out to an event like this. And as Amy was saying before, they first came here 2 summers ago and then came back last summer, and then now this summer we've had 3. This is the third of 3 visits. And I couldn't be happier for the exposure our little community here is getting, thanks to North Country Public Radio. So props to you guys. I'm going to try to stand as long as I can, but those of you who really know me know that I have lower back issues and I may have to sit. I could talk about what I do and what I have done for work up here in the North Country, but I have a feeling that most people don't really want to hear about the American Management Association in Saranac Lake at the old Trudeau Institute. I don't know, maybe somebody does. Or you don't want to hear about Sunmount in Tupper Lake. So I'm going to talk about my grandparents. My grandparents lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and a lot of new highways were being built in the 19-teens, 1920s, and into the 1930s. The 1920s in particular was a time when the Adirondacks was being opened for automobile traffic. Route 28, like from Old Forge to Inlet over to Racket Lake, that was 1920s. The first paved highway that came to Cranberry Lake, Route 3, was 1926. Think about that. How recent is that? We've got history here from the 1800s, but the first paved road was only 1926. Back in the day, it used to take people 2 days to get here from Canton. I mean, and that's well documented in the stories of Frederick Remington and others who came here that knew this place for the great fishing and hunting that it offered. Well, my grandparents took advantage of all these new roads into the Adirondacks. They came up on a car trip in 1934. They just happened to stop for lunch at Dave McAleese's Park Restaurant. Raise your hand. Ring a bell? Anybody? It later morphed into Ralphie's next door. I see more nods. Okay. And now it's a private residence. Well, back in the day, that was the neatest little restaurant. I got to tell you a little story about that place. It was just so cool. When I was a kid, we had moved away by the time I came along, and we were coming back for the summer in the 50s and 60s and what have you. Dave's restaurant, the Park Restaurant, had these tables with this metal enameled top, and then the legs were like curved wrought iron. The chairs had no legs. The chairs were attached by spring hinges to the legs of the table. So to sit down, you pulled the chair out and sat in it, and it would kind of push you back in. And when you got up to leave the table, the chair automatically pushed itself in. And I thought, this would be so cool to have at home. Instead of being told to push my chair in, it would go in by itself. Apparently, there's still one or two of these things still floating around. I think John McAleese has one, at least. But anyway, my parents stopped at the Park Restaurant for lunch. Great view of the lake. They were talking to a waitress there, and they said, this is a beautiful spot. Are there any homes for sale here? Do people live here? Are there houses for sale? And the waitress said, well, there's a really nice house that just came on the market, but you'd have to get somebody to take you to see it. And they're like, well, couldn't we just drive out and see it? And the waitress says, well, there's no road. It's water access only. My grandfather looked at my grandmother. My grandmother looked at my grandfather. We're going. By the end of the summer, they were living here. That fall, my father started attending school right here in this building. Fortunately for them, coming up here late in the summer, with winter about to set in about 5 minutes, my grandfather and my grandmother were fortunate that my grandmother's family had some money. They weren't vastly wealthy, but they were well off. So they could rely on her parents to help them if things really got tough. The house they moved into wasn't even winterized. So the first thing that happened was my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, came up and helped insulate, winterize the house, set up an electric system, and they were pretty much all set to go. But as far as North Country at work and how my grandfather fits into this, you might be wondering what he could possibly do for a job living in a house that was water access only. Think about that. For 2 months in the fall or longer, when the ice is setting in, and for 2 months in the spring, when the ice is going out, the only access was to walk 7 miles round trip through the woods to Cranberry Lake Village. So my grandfather, being very resourceful, took a lot of jobs. He learned from the locals all about where the good fishing holes were, where the trout were biting, what the best ponds were. He'd take hunters out in the fall. But I think the favorite job that my grandfather had, that this was a time when there were still a lot of standing dead trees in the lake, left over from the 1867 dam. My grandfather was one of the men that was paid 50 cents a tree to cut dead trees down in the hop yard, all around the lake in the various flows and bays. So that's kind of my little interesting story about North Country at work. Thank you.
So one of the things we're working on sort of tangentially to this project is, or related to it, is what's called these days the gig economy. But when I first moved up here, I thought of it as survival economy of the North Country. You piece together jobs. I was a substitute school teacher. I worked in an attorney's office. I was a waitress. I was a bartender. I helped organize a government grant to renovate houses. I did all kinds of jobs, and I thought it was just because I was young and I was a back to the lander and I didn't know anybody and I didn't know what I was doing. But come to find out, I was fitting into a long-standing pattern of making a living. When you live in a remote area like this that has primarily a seasonal economy, and you piece it together, just like your grandparents did, Mark. So I relate to that story, actually. And I also relate because my house not only had no insulation when I moved here in 1971, it had no plumbing. So I understand the rigor of that kind of start. Our next storyteller is Jim Lepar. Jim, where are you? Oh, there you are, Jim. Welcome, Jim Lepar.
Good evening. I'm here because as Henny Youngman, some of you may remember Henny Youngman. As Henny said, I started life as a child. And I was fortunate enough to get a job at Benson Mines when I was 16, primarily because my godmother was the nurse there. And she, as the saying goes, she had the inside track. She called me one day and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Going over to the lake swimming." I was 16. And she said, "No, you're not. You're coming up here. The engineers are hiring a person." So anyway, I came up and I got hired. And for the first year and a half, I couldn't go in the mine because you had to be 18 to be where the equipment was operating. So I spent that year and a half in the engineering department, which was in the office building that's visible from the highway. And when I turned 18, went down into the pit as an engineer's assistant. And I was there until 1954. And Louis Burns, who some of you may have known, retired, or actually took a job as a supervisor. And I was offered the job as a clerk of the works in the mine, in the pit. And I did that. And then one day in 1959, Homer Tiveridge, who was from Roman Ridge area, was the blasting superintendent, and he retired, or was retiring. And Art Peterson, who some may have known, walked in and said casually, "You know Homer's retiring." I said, "Well, I've heard that he has." He said, "Interested in the job?" And I was stunned. I mean, literally. At my age, take over a crew, most of them, or a good share of them, had more time on the job than I was old. And I soon learned after I took over the crew that there was some animosity, young whippersnapper and so forth. And so I decided one day to call them together, and I said, I think we need to have an understanding. I'm not here to change anything. I'm not here to take your job. I'm here to make your job easier, which in turn is going to make my job easier. And from then on, we had just the best relationship you can imagine. And at one time I had somewhere in 30 to 40 people drilling and blasting. And this was there until the mine closed. Actually, the official closure was in the spring of '78, but the last day of work was October 23rd, 1977. And I can recall that at that time there was no early disclosure. When the plant closed, it closed. And I can recall vividly that the people from the personnel department came through in the afternoon, mid-afternoon, and opened up the bulletin board, put up notices that this is the 3 to 11 shift is the last shift until further notice, indicating that it was kind of a temporary thing. But as everybody knows, it was not. So I was in a position as a supervisor I had a notion that things were operating very well. So I had stopped at the Mine Safety and Health office in Watertown and walked in, and I said, I remember what I said to him. I said, "Would MSHA have any need for any interest in a person who's 43 years old and has got almost 30 years in the mining business?" And he said, "Fill out an application." But of course, at the time I went in, the mine was still running. But the point being is that I had an application on file. So within a couple of weeks after the mine closed, I was working for Mine Safety and Health. And then in February, I believe, of '78, they needed some people in Aliquippa, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Hennepin, Illinois. And part of the agreement for the closure had been that before any new hires could be hired at any LTV steel plant, they had to give the people from Benson Mines the opportunity. So there were a number of us. I think there might have been a couple of dozen from Star Lake and Cranberry and Harrisville that went. And I went down there and finished up the balance of my 30 years and retired. And I think I've been pretty fortunate all my life because I was retiring and I planned on staying in Pennsylvania. I was in Aliquippa, which is just a few miles northwest of Pittsburgh. And I liked the area, and I was pretty intent on getting a job there. And, well, fortunately for me, unfortunately for John Dunk, who owned St. Lawrence Explosives, his mother passed away. And my father called me, and I had been a friend of John's because he was the explosives distributor for the mine. And so I called John to congratulate, or to, excuse me, to express my condolences. And, and he said, what are you up to? I said, well, I'm about ready to retire in August, and I'm gonna be working here. He said, wanna come to work for me? And so, well, I wound up being his manager of the Western New York site in Leroy, which is near Rochester. And I was out there until 1977, and I reached Social Security age, and that's a grueling job. That, not so much today because everything's done with bulk loading. Like, you've seen the bulk trucks that put feed into silos and so forth. That's the way they load explosives today. I did it with 50-pound bags and 30-pound tubes. And, but in any event, I took the job, and in 1997, turned old enough for Social Security, and decided that that was enough of the 50-pound bags, and decided to retire. And the gentleman that owned the company that did the drilling for us called me and said, would you like to go to work for me? So I accepted that in August, late August of 1977, and I'm still with them. I do consulting work for them from April until sometime around late October, early November, during the active season in the quarries. And so, as I said, I've been a pretty fortunate individual. Born and raised in Harrisville. The brief history of Benson Mines, the ore body was discovered in 1810 by surveyors. The state was planning a railroad from Albany to Ogdensburg, and they couldn't get their compasses, their surveying instruments to work. So all the way from Jayville near Harrisville up through this area. And so anyway, everybody tried to run the mine until 1910, and wasn't very successful. There was a couple of the, what was the one, Magnetic Iron Company tried it. In 1910, it was bought by the Benson Mines Company, which is the family. And as the saying goes, from there on out, it's pretty much history. Benson Mines and Newton Falls Paper Company. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Listen, when you retire from this current job, call me. I may have a job for you at the station. Or just follow him around. Jobs seem to like fall into his lap. There might be an extra one for the rest of us. It's a great story. Just so you know, the photographs that we've been collecting across the region, I don't know if we said this already, but to me it's kind of a cool thing. We've gotten grants to blow up the images. We select usually 20 or 30 images from a community that give a good range of the type of work that was done in that community. There's a lot more at ncpr.org/work, but this is a sample. And this collection is now part of your permanent Historical Association collection. We don't take these with us. These are, and we've done this in everywhere we've gone. These collections stay here because honestly, A, it's nice to add to a community's collection, and B, what are we going to do with it? We're a radio station, so it's okay. Right. All right. So, thanks. And I have to say, Claire and Amy have done this amazing job of selecting the images, getting them blown up, arranging them, and captioning them. It's been pretty amazing to watch the two of them at work. Our next storyteller is not related to the late great or late renowned or late notorious Che Guevara. However, Patricia Guevara does spell and pronounce her name the exact same way, and she is our next storyteller. Come on up, Patricia.
Thank you. When I married Fred, my husband, he used to tell people that that was his uncle, that Che Guevara was his uncle. And in today's world, there's only a few generations that even know who that was. Anyway, I'm here to tell you about my father, and his name was Wayne Morrow. My father was born in Pennsylvania, and after he graduated from high school, he went to Syracuse University, to the School of Forestry, but he only stayed there for 1 year. Now, I'm not sure why. Maybe it was the fraternity, I'm not sure. Anyway, after a year, he decided to come up here to the Ranger School. So he got here probably in 1932, and he graduated from the Ranger School in Montequina in 1933. And so at that time, in that same time frame, he met my mother. Now, I'll have to tell you how this works. This is a story about working, and I think this is what is considered working. He used to get in his canoe at the Ranger School and paddle all the way up to Cranberry Lake, to the McAleese. Well, it was a restaurant, but the McAleese, there was a dance hall in the back of it. Now, we're talking about the early 1930s, and that's where he met my mother. Now, the story is that I think he wasn't the only student who was paddling. There were others, I know. But I thought that's a bit of work when you figure there and then going back on a Saturday night. But what happened is that when he came through the door the first time of the dance hall, my mother was there. She was in this area, and she said to her friend, "There's the man I'm going to marry." You've heard those kinds of stories before. So my mother was born in South Edwards, so that's also in this area. And after she graduated from high school, she went to the Watertown School of Commerce. I believe was the name of it at this time. It's where she so she then started working in the paper mill as a secretary. So after my father graduated from the Ranger School, he went to work for the CCC. And that's another term that not everybody in this generation knows. But it certainly was a wonderful program because it did put men to work right after the Depression. So he went to work for the CCC, and he was a crew boss working in this area. And one of the things that they did do was they built the first campsite loop up here at the New York State campsite. It's much larger now, but that was a small loop that they built. And also, you see throughout the North Country these stands of pines that are like all in a row, one after another. They built a lot of those, or they planted a lot of those. They didn't understand at the time that that's not good forestry, but you'll see those here in the North Country. So after his time with the CCC, he went to work at the paper mill. And he stayed there. My mother was working there as a secretary, but he was there for a very long time, a number of years. From probably 1936 to 1978 when he left there. And he was a vice president, he had no experience with paper making, but he worked his way along and ended up as a vice president of production. And one thing that you may not know about the paper mill, or many people don't know, is that it was one of the first, or at least in my mind, very early business that was recycling paper. They did not make all their paper out of wood. They made their paper out of what they called waste paper. And bales of paper from publishers and other places would come in, and they would start with that, and they would make new paper out of it. I think that's an interesting thing about that paper mill. Another thing is when my father was there, Fred tells a story of after he became part of my life, we were touring the paper mill, and my hair was kind of tall. And these belts were just running everywhere. You know, this is before OSHA, so all of these belts running. And Fred says that he caught a hold of me and kind of ducked me because maybe my hair, I would have been caught, I don't know. So anyway, so those give you that gives you a peek into some of the kinds of things that were going on in the area in those older manufacturing plants. Very, very scary stuff. He then about in the 60s, he bought a piece of property here on Cranberry Lake, and he had a lean-to on that was the only thing that was on there. Well, there was an outhouse and a lean-to, and the lean-to came from, he got that through Lou Plumley, who was one of the managers or directors of the Ranger School, and that was on our property for 14 years, and then later on, my father built a small cottage on the lake. My sister and I grew up in Newton Falls. We were in the era that when the Clifton Fine Central School opened, we were both able to go there. We were there, some of the first students there. And my sister has just moved here permanently to be back here in Cranberry Lake. She's been in Ohio for a number of years, except for summers when we would come back and forth. Fred and I are in Ohio, but we can spend 4 months up here now that that we're both have been retired for some time, and we can come up here and spend our time here on Cranberry Lake. It's a wonderful place to be.
Thank you so much, Patricia. That was great. And that's the thing about these storytelling sessions is Amy and Claire and I and Tyler and the other people who have been working on this project, we've heard a lot of stories. But every time someone tells a story, we learn more about the place. So the whole notion of how early paper was being recycled is really interesting to me. Yeah.
I'd just like to point out to everybody, Pat made a comment about there not being OSHA at the time. When the talks are over, come take a look at this picture inside that paper mill and notice the young man working barefoot.
Yeah, we see a lot of that. In fact, Patricia's story, you also alluded to your mother's work as secretary for the company. One of the things Amy and I, when we were starting this project, had to be very intentional about was keeping our eyes open for women at work. Because by and large, women were not photographed. I mean, it was rare enough for anyone to be photographed at work. We're finding in most collections, 2 to 5% of any collection relates to work. But there's a tiny fraction of those pictures in any way show women at work. So, for example, the picture straight back next to Claire of the logging camp, you can see all the women standing in the yard. Those women were for sure the cooks in the man camp. That's what they were doing then. They were brought out for the photograph session. We have photographs we've sort of brought forward of women feeding chicken in their front yard, or help me here, secretaries. Secretaries are the teachers. I mean, this is, and nurses. Yes, we have stories about great story we did about nursing. Of course, many women were homemakers, and in fact, I like to remind everyone of that little ditty when I talk about all those women who were homemakers, particularly on farms, that man may work from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done, right? I mean, if you have ever lived on a farm, my old neighbor found me tonight. She's living, I was so excited to see her. So anyway, enough. But we're trying to be very intentional about not just taking the obvious, but finding and looking really closely at these old photographs for people who have been less well documented over the years, whether it's women, people of color, a lot of children at work. Native Americans from this neck of the wood, we're really trying to pay attention to that. Okay, enough of that. Next. Leroy Pete is up next for us. Come on, Leroy. Give him a warm welcome. He's a little nervous.
I have a lot of notes.
That's good.
I'll start off by telling you, in the fall of '69, I got out of the Army and I was working for the Adirondack Plywood as a forklift operator. And it was not always the best place to work. Come spring, and it was '68 I got out, '69, of an acquaintance of mine, Cameron Hutchins, he said, why don't you go to Newton Falls and apply for a job there? He says, Gordon Black's giving interviews, I believe it was on Wednesdays. He said, just go up there and check it out. So I did. And I walked into Newton Falls and says, where's Gordon Black and where do you go for interviews? This person said, see this bench over here? You just sit down, there's a bunch of guys sitting there, and when they call your name or call you, go in and go see them. So I got called in. He says to me, what have you been doing? He says, well, I work at Adirondack Plywood. He says, why are you leaving or want to leave and find another job? I says, I'm making $1.94 an hour. And they started off at $2.98. He said, I guess that's a good reason for you wanting to leave there. And so he asked me my experiences in the Army, and I told him. And also let him know I was a forklift operator, and he thought that was really something he could use. He said, who did you put down on your application? I said, what application? I said, I didn't see anything or hear anything about an application. He says, well, you get that at the time office, and do you know Fred Baker? I said, yes, he's the principal of a school in Tupper Lake. He said, would he give you a good reference? I said, yes. He says, you know any cops that would give you a good reference? I said, yeah, I think I can manage that. And so I went with my application, got the references, and went right back. A week later, I started working. There were people on that bench that had been going there time after time, and I was just lucky. So I started off in the labor pool, did a lot of jobs around the mill, working for maintenance, painting. There was one point, I don't like heights. They had me on a 30-foot ladder, reaching up, painting, and it was a wooden ladder, wobbled both ways. And there was a guy on the roof reaching down to me, and he couldn't quite reach his one spot, and I started to step up, and I realized it was a broken rung. I said, I'm not going back up there again. And another thing, at the mill, there's what they call a penstock. It's a huge water line that runs through, that feeds water to generators to generate power. And we had to pour sawdust into that to plug up the holes. And it worked on various machines throughout the mill. And finally, they put me on number 1 roll wrap. And it was number 1, number 2 paper machine. That was a bull job, I tell you. And I eventually worked up to 3 and 4, and that was even harder. And I see these guys sitting in a nice, cool inspector's office, and boy, I'd love to be there. And so after that job, I went on to become an inventory operator, where you moved rolls that came off the paper machine and rewinders and stacked them with a lift truck that had a clamp on it. And I was very happy on that job. And of course, they said, well, you got to move up to the next job, and that's operating a forklift and taking care of skids that came off the trimmer, and also jockey trailers. Jockeying trailers was some fun in the wintertime. And one day I had one that started good, stuck, and one that didn't start good, that didn't have any traction because it didn't have chains, and I had both of them. one not started and one stuck. But what made me concerned me, we had a trailer loaded with lift trucks pulled away from the dock for overnight. Excuse me. And the next morning, we had to back the trailer up, unload some lift trucks. They were there because the foreman didn't want people throughout the mill using the shipping lift trucks. So we opened up the door. It was a brand new trailer, and we could smell gas. There was 4 of us. And I commented to Walt Smithers, I said, you better put your pipe out, you know. And we walked around, and Jack LaPlatney got on the lift truck and tried starting it, and nothing happened. So there was also Neil Miller. We all walked out except for Jack. He stayed on the lift truck. Neil went off to the side. I started climbing on a larger lift truck, and Walt was behind me. Jack tried it one more time, and the trailer exploded. He caught on fire. I was almost in the seat of the lift truck, blew me back about 6 feet. And so we were putting Jack out with our hands. So I wasn't really keen on staying on the job any longer. And a bid came up for what they call electrical switchboard. And I said, well, I'll get away from the job, I'll go up and sign it. And I ended up getting it. They figured anybody with 30 or more years would get it, and I was only there a few years. So I worked on that, and I took care of keeping track of the usage of the mill, the electrical power, turning generators on and off, water wheels and steam generators, calling in maintenance, and also answering the phone for fire. So I'd set off the fire alarms besides. And I was one of the few people that got to blow the steam whistle before it was a Swedish company decided we're wasting too much steam. So, onward. I got bumped off that job when they had a cutback, so I worked on a coating platform where we made coating for the coater, which is liquid coating that's applied to the paper and held on with heat and pressure. Then it's carried on to the super calendar where it's polished, and then the rewinders where it's cut down. And that was a dirty job, and I didn't like that, so I got another bid. I went to the process lab, where we tested raw materials that went into the paper and also checked how the machines are. Oh, my time is up already. Keep going. Okay. Time flies when you're having fun. So from there, I bid on the coating inspection, where we inspected paper, 3 and 4 paper machine, coating, 3 and 4 paper inspector. Remember I told you that's where I wanted to be? It took me 20 years to get there. And after that, Gary Ward and I were the last 2 people working there. The mill was down, and we were there answering the phone. And I left the mill, and I turned off the light in 3 and 4 inspection, and that was in the year 2000, and started looking for a job at 54. I worked as a bus driver for Rothel in Ogdensburg and a ambulette driver in Tupper Lake. I split my time one way or the other, and then the following year I got a job at Sun Mountain, worked there 10 years and retired. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there any job there that you didn't have? I mean, it's pretty remarkable history. It's quite a selection. Next time you tell us about that. Okay. By the way, I just want to tell you that, people know me as the station manager of North Country Public Radio, but one of my former bosses is sitting right there. Sue Washburn is the person responsible more than anyone else for seeing me be promoted from development director to station manager in 1985. Her decision. And many of you know Sue and Kristen from Wanakina and from Kristen's amazing photography. And her exhibit is up at St. Lawrence. When's the opening? The reception? Or 10th, and you're giving a talk. So if I came here tonight, you all can get up there on the 10th, right? Thanks so much. That was really good. That was really interesting. Your friend or your colleague who caught on fire, I assume he survived? You were able to?
I'm not sure of the shape because he never worked.
He's a good friend of mine.
And how is he today?
He's debilitated. He has real physical problems, but he's active. I'll put it that way.
That's great. That's great.
He started pulling, his cuffs were still flaming like burning, pulling the cuffs off, on his jacket, and skin came right off.
Oh,
Pair of gloves, burned on
that's like serious burns.
I had flash burns on my forehead. I wiped my forehead, and they said, "Don't touch." I was taking the skin off,
Oh,
wiped my beard off. Walt Smithers, who was behind me, blew the stuffing out of his jacket. Neil Miller was on the side of the trailer, and he got flash burns on his face.
you're all it's amazing all of you survived it.
Up in the cafeteria.
Yeah, that's amazing. Amazing. Okay, who's up next? Butch Brown is going to come tell us a story now. Come on up, Butch.
Good evening. When I got asked to do this, I really didn't know what I wanted to talk about. And I did a lot of thought. In fact, I've even been sitting here thinking about it. I grew up in Star Lake. I spent the majority of my life in Star Lake, town of Fine. I live in Oswegatchie right now. And one of the things that twerked me is when I grew up in the 60s without knowing it, it was going the other way. This area had peaked. Employment had peaked. Population had peaked. But when you're 16, 14, 15 years old, you don't realize it. When you get 25 years older, you suddenly realize how things have changed. When I was 13 or 14, and sitting here tonight thinking about it, it was probably because my father didn't have a lot of money, and my mother said, "I'm not going to give you any money." So they pushed me out the door to find odd jobs. And my mother worked in the post office, and she was active in the Presbyterian Church, so she knew a widowed school teacher, a widowed postal worker, and at 13 or 14, I went to work, raking leaves, shoveling snow, babysat a cat. That's the greatest job to be, is a fixed male tomcat, does nothing but sit in the window. And one thing led to another, and I don't honestly know why I did it, but you had to get, I assume you still have to get working papers today at 14. I went to the high school office, I got working papers, and for some of the people in here, I know a couple would remember it, there was a general store in Star Lake, Tears Store, and Howard Clark ran it for the Tears family who lived somewhere out of state. And I applied for a job. I don't even know how I found out about the job, but Howard hired me. Then Howard got sick, and Willie ran the store. Well, they trained me to stock shelves and help. There was a meat cutter, and worked on the cash register. Well, they had a great big, huge cash register, and had a crank, had mammoth buttons, drawer came out, would kill you, and all this stuff. And they had the forms that you write down the objects that they're purchasing. There was a terrific amount of people that worked at the mines that were salaried, management, and at the paper mill, and they charged their groceries. So when they would come in to buy their groceries, you wrote everything down, and then Howard or Willie would take it down back and they would tabulate it up. Well, they trained me to work on the counter, and I'm 14 years old. I don't know many of these people. And this man would come in the store, and he'd have this woman with him, and they had these little metal shopping carts. They were about that wide. There was 2 tiers to them, little metal wheels, and they would go around. The aisles were very narrow. And she would be picking stuff up, and she would be putting them in the cart. And when the cart was full, she would bring it up to the counter, and she'd unload it, and I would write down everything, put it in a box on the floor or in a bag, and she would continue going around. Well, back then they had ice cream coolers with the cardboard containers, and they had cardboard boxes with ice cream in them, and they had the flip tops. And this man would walk around with her, and he would say things to her, and I watched him, and I said, he reaches in there, and he gets a fudgesicle, and he peels the fudgesicle off, and he eats it. And he continues around the store, and all of a sudden I see him get another fudgesicle. I'm thinking, I got to pay 5 cents for these fudge sickles. He's got to pay 5 cents. So I write the fudge sickle down, and I write the other fudge sickle down. They take all their groceries out. Away they go. I turn the slip in. Later on that day, Howard comes up to the counter, and he is right in a panic. He's about this far off the floor. Do you realize what the hell you did? He said, straight up, whoa, I'm 14. Nobody swore at me because I've just got a hard job. He says, that's Andrew Schuler. I said, oh, okay. People in here know who Andy Schuler is, right? He made it Schuler's potato chips. He owned all those thousands of acres of state land up there. He was a millionaire. He's buried in a mausoleum in the woods right now, right? You don't charge a millionaire 10 cents for fudge sickles. I did. And Howard never forgave me, And to this day, I occasionally think about it, and I say, at the time, it seemed like the thing to do. And I went on for different jobs after that, and jobs were easy to come by for a 14, 15-year-old kid. There's a man in this room right now. We used to golf caddy on the golf course for the paper mill, and we made money, and all these different things. When J&L went down in 77, and I was working there, for the young people in here that think extensions on unemployment are a new thing, no. 1977, I got a federal extension. Worst thing that ever happened to my marriage. I drew 65 weeks of unemployment, 52 weeks of union sub-pay. Not good for looking for a job because you're making 90% of your pay and it's not taking taxes out of it. But I was still hustling jobs. Dr. Pearson, who a lot of people in here know, I think I went over and asked him. He said, and he very dignified man, yes, AD, I have some work for you. I said, good. He said, come back tomorrow. So I come back, and I'd mow his lawn, I'd rake his leaves, whatever it was. So I came the next one day. I'd worked for him several times. And he says, come tomorrow morning. So I came, and I knocked on the door. His wife, Marion, opens the door. Now, Marion was a special lady. She could get dressed up for a ball and look like she'd been in a war. Stockings down to her ankles, a house dress that had breakfast all over the front of it. And that was her. And she answered the door, and she says, AD, how are you? And I said, I'm very good, Mrs. Pearson. What are you here for? I said, Dr. Pearson wants me to do some work. Oh, well, I have something for you to do, she says. I said, okay. So we go out to the front. She has this beautiful flower garden. She's working on it. She says, I need some help planting these flowers. Now, she picked a good person because I actually enjoy gardening. Even back then I did. So here we are sitting in the dirt. She's got this house dress on, just not appropriate attire, but doesn't bother her. And we're planting flowers. Dr. Pearson comes out, and he looks down his nose at her like this, and he said, Marion, what are you doing? And she says, Robert, we're planting flowers. Okay. And he turned around and he walked away. Later on that afternoon, he says to me, come around back. I went around back, and he said, we are going, visit to relatives or somewhere for the weekend. He said, you see all these bags of turf builder here? I said, yes. He says, out back, through the dining room window, is this beautiful carpet of little tiny white daisies, about as big as my fingernails. Beautiful. He said, I want you to spread that on those flowers. All of it. Okay, fine. They're weeds. Unbeknownst to me, Marion loved them. She came back on Sunday night, and there wasn't a flower alive. Nothing. They were dead. And she said, Robert, did you have AD put something on my flowers? Why, Marion, I didn't know those were your flowers. And that was all there was to it. So.
That's great. That's great. The population, you raised the thing about peaking work life certainly in a good part of the North Country. The population of St. Lawrence County is essentially the same today as it was in 1900. It's pretty unusual around the world. Yeah, it's a pretty amazing thing. So the level of economic growth, one little thing will kind of spurt up, and then and it's, but heavy industry, And the extractive industries, that's what really fueled a lot of the development of the whole North Country. I mean, Amy and Claire and I, we've looked at so many images of quarries, of mines, of mills. Lumbering is an extractive industry, basically. And once that was depleted, we're pretty far off the beaten track. So, in any case, yeah.
I looked up a couple of statistics that pretty much fit with what Butch was saying and what you're saying. In 1960, Benson Mines had 840 employees. When they closed in 1977, they had just over 300.
Yeah.
And in 1975, LTV Steel was supporting about 1,400 people. They're paying $400,000 in taxes. In 1975, the school population was 1,400. In 1979, it was 625.
Yeah.
Pretty much tells you what very much motion.
Well, just in the years I've lived in the Herman DeKalb area and, in the other part of this county, the school, when I moved there, had a total K through 12 population of probably close to 500. And now it's maybe 300. I think that's pretty typical for my son went to school there. There's the same 20, 25 kids, you go through school with. And now there was one class per grade of about 25 kids. And now it's hard to put even one class together in a grade. Our last scheduled storyteller, and we're certainly hoping we've inspired a couple of you to get up here after this storyteller and share a little bit of your work life, is Bernard. Oh, God, I'm going to... Wait, 1, 2, 3. Thank you all very much. Come on, Bernie.
I feel like Rodney Dangerfield. You're not the first one that's had trouble with it. After 5 speakers who've done a wonderful job, I thought being last was going to be the best, but I don't know if it is. But here we go. I was born actually in the Adirondacks, on the northeast corner of the Adirondacks, in a little hamlet called Lion Mountain. Some of you may know. Some of you may not know where it is. A mining town, just like Star Lake. And went to school there. And my first job was working for the milkman on home delivery. And I got $1 a day. Every morning before school, I delivered milk to the houses, and which was really cool. I thought it was great. I got $6 a week. And my mother would say, put it away, put it away, put it away. And then after I graduated from high school, I worked at the Diamond International in Plattsburgh, earned all the money to go to the Ranger School. I went to the Ranger School in 1970, graduated in 71. Tough school to go to, probably the best forestry college in the United States. No doubt about it. And no vehicles. We could not have vehicles while we were going there. So you were there. You thumbed to Star Lake. In January, you stayed in school because it was 30 below. But anyway, after I took the Forest Rangers exam while at the Ranger School. And as state budgets go, they weren't hiring. I scored rather well on it. They weren't hiring. Finally, in 1974, I was hired as a forest ranger in the Catskills. I worked 2 years in Sullivan County, and fortunate for me, the position in Star Lake came open. Paul Hartman was the ranger there. He got a promotion, and I transferred here because going to the ranger school, I knew what it was like here. I loved the area here. So in 1976, my wife Blanche and our oldest son Brad moved to Wanakena. And we raised 2 other children, Blake and Brianna. But Blanche went to work at the hospital. She was a nurse. So both of us are working here. The ranger job, as most of you know, being around here, you know, it's search and rescue, it's fire suppression, and it's law enforcement, but and Cranberry Lake was, I would say, the best district in the state of New York. I was here 31 and a half years as a ranger. And a lot of stories. I could probably outdo the 7 minutes, but as we sat and talked that day for what, an hour? But it was a fantastic time. But talking about, we moved here in '76. J&L closed in '77. Our son Brad, when he started school, there was 600 and some in school. Now there's what, 300. You know, so it's been tough. It's been tough, but every one of our kids and my wife Blanche and I, we love living in this area and working in this area. One story I have to tell, and it pertains to this lake. It was in 1993, March 14th. Two snowmobiles. We had a terrible snowstorm. This is March. You had 2 feet of snow on the ground already, and we got over 2 feet of snow in this storm. 2 snowmobilers from Cranberry Lake went to Dumas's, which is fine. And after, you know, I mean, that's good. I mean, that's what we all do, right? But anyway, when they were leaving Dumas's, Buzz Dumas said, why don't you guys go down the highway with your sleds? There's not a vehicle on the road. But they didn't. They came back the trails through Massawepie, Burnt Bridge Pond, and they didn't show back up at Cranberry. We got the call. The next morning, we had a few rangers here. Volunteer fire department was working. The problem was with 2.5 feet of really fluffy snow, the sleds, it was really tough to go anywhere. But we did. I mean, we searched the whole day. It had quit snowing. That night, now this is the 15th of March, 25 below zero. And I listened to people, oh, by the way, I go to Florida in the wintertime. But I listened to people say, oh, winter is so long, March is coming, it's going to be, no, March is winter in itself most of the time. It was 25 below zero, and one of the fathers of one of the young men that was missing, he just feared his son was dead. And I said, you know, don't count him out, you know, not yet. The next day, we had a helicopter, because the weather was good, and one of the state police helicopter, and we had a ranger in there, and he spotted the only thing he could see. He happened to see the glare of the windshield of the snowmobile through the snow in Bear Mountain Swamp. And so they landed, and he went over, and sure enough, it was their sled, and the old float camps that were in Brandy Brook Flow. Most of us know about them. They were there then, and they had actually made it to one of those float camps. And so we picked them up at the helicopter and flew them out. Both of them lost toes out of this ordeal. But other than that, they're here to tell about it, you know. So many stories that in my line of work we had like that, and happy endings. Not always, but most of them were.
So you said you had a law enforcement element to your work
Yes.
too, of course.
Yes.
Was there any time when you seriously found yourself in that role?
You know, you were writing tickets like you know, any other law enforcement officer. Once in a while, yeah, you'd have to physically arrest somebody and bring them to the judge, whomever, you know, and stuff. But I do have to say one thing: as our children got older and they got to the age where, you know what, it's time for you to start getting ready for the real world and stuff. And we'd sit at the dinner table, and my oldest would say, Ma, he's not going to talk about the milk truck again, is he? But I did anyway.
So I kind of grew up at the other end of the state in Manhattan. And I vividly remember we had milk delivered when I was a kid. It came in the bottles in the morning. And we also had seltzer in like those, what I think of as clown seltzer bottles. My father had a crate of seltzer delivered to our doorstep once a week. That came once a week. Also, moving from Manhattan in 1971 to the Maple Ridge Road from Broadway, my husband at the time and I said, well, March is spring, right? I was such a rube. I was such a city slicker. So we moved up in the beginning of March in 1971, and there was so much snow. Well, we pulled in. We immediately got all the vehicles stuck. We were up with a mover truck, and I didn't know how to drive because I had grown up in Manhattan. And it's true. I didn't learn how to drive until I moved to the North Country. But down the road, we hear this. It's like 10 o'clock at night. We hear put, 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 put. And it's what I later came to know was a farm-all tractor dating back to maybe the early 40s or something. My neighbor came down, heard we were stuck, could tell from us whining that we were stuck, pulled us out. And we went into the cellar of the house, and no one had been in the house all winter. So there was a nice wood furnace that stood about this high, but the ice it was encased in was about this high. So, and then outside, but the best part was outside, in the front yard, we thought, oh, there's a little snow in the front yard, right? The end of March, when the snow really started to break away, this turquoise surface emerged. It was the hood of a car that we didn't even know was in the front yard. So anyway, hey, anyone else want to step up here and share a story? You ready to come on up? Come on up. Tell us your name. We need to know your name when you come up here. Amy, did you get her name beforehand or no? Okay, so tell us your name, ma'am. Or ma'ams. Are you both going to tell a story? No. Oh, okay. Tell us just your name, though. Be sure to tell us
I
your
need to
name
get
and
this.
close to the microphone.
Yep. My name is Barbara Slater, and I'm from the Robinson family. And I have missed one summer in my life of being here. So my first summer was 1934. My grandparents, George and Ruth Robinson, had very good friends in Canton where they lived. One family was the Barr family, and the other family was the Cook family. The gravestones of those three families are next to each other in Canton. They decided to build camps up here, and so they bought 3 pieces of property next to each other right across the lake. And my grandfather finished in 1934, and so I did spend my first summer here. And it was quite a life that I've had because I consider this my real home. Wherever else I am is where I'm living. But this is my real home. And I was a very curious kid. And so I adored older people. And I used to take off during the day and go visit whoever I could find at home. And I had the stories, and you wouldn't believe some of those stories, of all the older people who lived here. So I had homeowners, boat builders, a person who showed me how you use horses to use the horses with the lumber. And a lot of the stories I wouldn't dare repeat. I really wouldn't, but I do remember them. Not everybody in this community was a good person. The other thing that I used to like to do is I love to explore deserted buildings. And I've been in an awful lot of them, including one big one that no longer exists right over there. Yep. And also the houses that the workers lived in on the 3 streets. So, you know, the top people, middle people, not so middle people. And I found that there were some people still living in those houses, and nobody knew it. Of course, I didn't tell anyone about it. Now, the working kind of thing isn't me, it's my father, Gil Slater. And he was the principal and a teacher in the school here, and also did a lot of work with some of the young people that he taught. And he also took some of them fishing and took some of them hunting. And after he retired, he started taking other people back out into the woods to places that he had visited years ago, hunting and fishing. And he kind of got known as a guide in his last few years rather than a principal of the school. And he did a lot of interesting different things. At one time, he was asked if he would translate for someone who did not speak English terribly well. He's, sure, I don't care. Chagall. Marc Chagall. He translated for Marc Chagall, went with him to different places where he wanted to paint so that he could get the best view, actually. And when Marc Chagall left here, just before he left, he wanted to give my dad, you know, something to remember him by. So he handed my father this piece of paper. And my father didn't even look at it. He just thanked him, and Marc went this way, and Dad went this way. Well, he told me not too long before he died, yeah, that artist, he gave me a piece of paper, and oh, it was awful. My God, there were people with animal heads, and he says, all this stuff on it, trees that were upside down. He says, so as soon as I got away from him, I wadded it up and threw it away. So that's a memory that I have of my father. He was a wonderful teacher, and he was a fantastic principal, and he got along well with most people. But oh, that memory is not a good one.
That is why Barb Slater today is such a wonderful patron of the arts. She's still atoning.
Thank you so much. Can I invite anyone else up? We have another brave soul. Oh, come. You're next. Come on up. Come on. We have, and give your name and, okay, so we all know who you are.
Hi, I'm Alex Ross. I grew up almost next door to Pat Morrow in Newton Falls, and I just wanted to add a little bit more to the Newton Falls story of how my grandfather, also Alex Ross, first came here. But one thing about the recycling and the paper mill is they didn't even call it recycling then. Recycling didn't exist. It was de-inking. They had a de-inking plant. But my grandfather, Al Ross, grew up in Staten Island, and he went to the forestry school, except when he went in the 1920s, the forestry school was in Cornell. And when he graduated, he worked for a Canadian company that was doing a survey up here of the woods, and he fell in love with the area. And he happened to also eat dinner one night at the Star Lake Hotel and meet my grandmother, who grew up in Canton and was a math teacher in Ithaca, New York. She graduated from St. Lawrence. But in the summer, she and her sister worked as waitresses at the Star Lake Inn. So he met her, he fell in love with the area, he fell in love with my grandmother, and he decided, I've got to get a job back there. And, getting a job back there, working for this surveying company that's going to go from, one logging job to another isn't going to work. So when he went back to Staten Island to visit his family, he went to see the owners of the paper mill. McGraw-Hill owned the paper mill. So he just took the ferry over to Manhattan, went to McGraw-Hill, introduced himself, and convinced them that they needed a forester. They needed somebody to manage the paper mill's forests up here, and he got a job. McGraw-Hill hired him. He came up here and worked here and lived here in Newton Falls until he died in the 1970s. And my grandmother, who stopped teaching math when she got married, was, during the war, there was a shortage of math teachers, so she was called in and taught at the Newton Falls School for the duration of the war and until Clifton Fine School started then. So I just wanted to add that little bit of just this area has always been so compelling to people, that little bit more about Newton Falls.
Thank you so much. Great addition to the lore. You come on up. You have a quickie. Tell us who you are. I know you're related to the other Guevara here and Shay.
I'm Fred Guevara. I want to tell you a quick story because Bernie was very modest about the law enforcement capability that the Rangers have in this area, but I have a story about that will really impress you about high crimes in this area in which the Forest Rangers were involved. My sister flew in from Denver, and she started in the morning at the Denver International Airport and ended up at the Ogdensburg Airport. And that in itself was just amazing to her, to go from this huge metropolitan airport to this little tiny airport in a little tiny airplane. And then she came here. One morning when she was here at about 6 a.m., I got up and went outside as I always do and just took a little walk around. And there was a car that pulled up in our back lot. And two kids got out of the car and ran into the woods. And so I said, gee, that's very suspicious. So I don't know how I called or how I knew what to do, but I called the law enforcement officer. I don't know, maybe it was Bernie. But the car shows up and says, oh, well, we have to do something about this. So he gets on the radio and he calls the canine people. And they bring two dogs. And my sister is laughing hysterically because she said, in Denver, in order to bring the police dogs out, you'd have to have a double murder and a rape. And here they are very serious. They got these dogs and they're sniffing the car and they go into the woods and find those kids. They never really found the kids, but I just thought that was an amazing. Was that you, Bernie? Okay.
Last call for a story. If not, we'll thank all of you who came out tonight. This was great having you here. Thanks to Mark once again for his hospitality. Thanks to our friends from AIR for making the trek from the Boston area. And really, thanks to all of you for coming out to hear your neighbors' stories and sharing stories with us. It's something really special.